Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Wellington Social Society's talk for tonight. I'm Mark, and I'm going to be interviewing Sara Salman here. This is a sort of a Q&A kind of thing. And we'll do that for a wee while. And then after that, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back for a Q&A from you guys. But before that, I want to just quickly talk about the Wellington Social Society. We do these events every... Is that better? Yeah, we do these events every month. This month we've had 2 events actually, every month. We do them here at Bed and Squalor, who have kindly given us the use of this venue. So please spend lots of money at the bar to thank them. The Wellington Social Society is part of the Federation of Socialist Societies, which is, so there's 3 groups, there's Wellington, Christchurch and Otago. And we put out a magazine called Commonweal, which you can buy at the counter there. We've also got a mailing list. If you want to put your name down and email address, we'll give you notices of events we're doing like this every month. And also, if you want to join us, you can give us some money by signing up and becoming a member, and you get a free magazine and a whole bunch of other stickers and various things. So there are some exec members in the room who will happily sign you up, and they'll put their hands up now. Yeah, cool. So see those people afterwards. All right. So tonight we're going to talk about this book here. You can see that the Shaming State. How the US treats citizens in need. And Sara wrote this last year? 2023. Yeah, based on her research that she did in the US. Sara is a criminologist at Victoria University. She studies structural and political violence, and she examines the relationship between the state and citizen in late modern Western democratic regimes. So the Shaming State examines the erosion of social rights and the political use of shame against people in need, and argues that shame exacerbates the decline of social solidarity. Sara also researches terrorism and extremist violence. We won't talk about that tonight. We'll get her in for another talk, maybe in a while. But how I'm going to do this is just do a sort of ask Sara a few questions to do the talking. And the first one for Sara is, can you tell us how you became interested in the topic of shaming as a political thing?
Sure. Can I just say thank you as well for inviting me. I do love this place. I've presented in different spaces, and this is by far the most charming. I love all the chandeliers and the lights. So thank you for having me. This is really lovely. So in terms of my interest in this particular question around how citizens are treated in times of need, it comes out of my own training in sociology, wanting to understand the way citizens relate to the state and the way the state relates to citizens. And I initially, so this comes out of my PhD. I was initially interested in understanding experiences of refugee resettlement. And it was because at the time, many years ago, in the 2010s, I was an interpreter for an organization that was assisting Iraqi and Syrian refugees trying to get into the United States. And I would be on these calls interpreting or translating. And one of the things that would often come up is usually the organization was assisting people who had snags in their refugee application. And these were people who had assisted the American military or the American forces during the invasion of Iraq, and their lives came under danger because of that. And so encountering these kinds of snags was a bit difficult for them, right? Because their life really was in danger. And on these phone calls, I would often be asked, very sort of strongly, isn't this your democracy? Isn't this the United States, the greatest country in the world? Why am I not being let in? And I've sacrificed everything. And it sort of stuck with me of this idea, well, what does that mean? What does it mean that you live in this country that's a democracy that's supposed to provide all sorts of protections to people who've sacrificed everything for it? And so I initially thought this would be the project, but around the same time, so I was studying in New York, and around the same time, a big hurricane hit New York. And may have heard of it, Hurricane Sandy. And it was, at the time, labeled the second most expensive hurricane, the first being Hurricane Katrina, which you might already also know about. It's a very important historical moment in the United States. And at the time, in New York, there was a sense of elation about the government's response. It was celebrated, it was efficient, it was great, it was, everything was great. New Yorkers came together, there was a government across the aisle were working together. And it was a sort of a narrative that didn't really match the reality on the ground. And what you saw in terms of the response to Hurricane Sandy was that there was also a differentiated response where people didn't receive the assistance that they needed. And these were people who also had done everything for their country. And so it got me thinking about wanting to understand at what point do you, or can you experience a moment of social vulnerability, so that is having a need that cannot be met by your individual grit, your income, your immediate community, a need that is really beyond your means. And once you experience that need, at what point can you then sort of feel like a legitimate, deserving person that would then receive the adequate government assistance? So that's sort of really what started the book, is I wanted to know under what conditions can you ask for help from the government without being abandoned or shamed for asking for help.
Right. And in the book, your research focuses on two different groups, and they're quite different. You've already kind of covered, the Iraqi refugees and the victims of the storm. Can you talk about how you chose those two groups for your research?
Yes. So I wanted to study this in the most naive way possible. So I wanted to take as a given the dominant kind of narrative in the United States, and to some extent you see the same narrative in New Zealand, right? Which is that help will come for those who help themselves. So if you have participated in this kind of the social contract, you worked, you did all the right things, you'll get the help that you need. People who are deemed lazy or all sorts of other negative kind of attributes won't get assistance. So I wanted to actually study that, and so I picked two groups who are different in some ways, but who share some similarities, and I decided to focus on Iraqi resettled refugees who arrived into the United States on the special immigrant visa, which is a visa that was designed explicitly in response to it was in response to the dangers that were facing Iraqi families who had assisted American military forces or American, and allied forces. And that visa is really, it's the best case scenario for refugee resettlement, because it means that you can be resettled immediately from Iraq. You don't have to spend time in any other state. Usually people spend years waiting in adjacent countries like Syria or Jordan or what have you. So, and it is reserved for people who have helped the American forces in some way, which meant also that there are people who might have better means back in Iraq anyway. So they might have had, they came from middle-class families, or they had professional careers. So they're like the best case scenario of like coming to the country, they're seen as legitimate refugees, they're here in the right way, didn't skip the line on all of those other kinds of negative discourses that you hear about now. And I just wanted to know, once they arrive, what happens, what kind of help do they get? And I had some understanding that the help will be a little bit tricky, because once you arrive, you're no longer a refugee, you're immediately transformed into a burden, because the forms of assistance that are offered to refugees in the United States resemble poor relief. So things like food stamps, Medicaid, which is medical assistance for people under a certain income threshold, things like that. So I expected that you will have some difficulties with that. The second group is white New Yorkers who are homeowners, who lived in this particular neighborhood that was what would be called the low-lying area, so it was quite vulnerable to floods. But this is a neighborhood that is home to first responders, people who are there at the scene on 9/11, military personnel. It's a neighborhood that has American flags everywhere, very patriotic, and people have worked all their lives, so they've met all the conditions of desirable citizens and desirable citizenship. And worst case scenario was the storm, right? So up to the point of the storm, they were, I don't want to say self-sufficient because that there's no such thing, right? But up to the point of the storm, they didn't have these kinds of acute needs. And had been doing okay up to that point. They have good community organizations, very active, and it was truly the point of the storm where they experienced this incredible need that required a robust state intervention. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I wanted to know whether the attenuated access to services that Iraqis might have had anything to do with the kind of assistance they were receiving. Is there a substantial material difference between assistance that is reserved for people who live in poverty and assistance for people who are middle class who then have a disaster like a cyclone or a hurricane destroy their homes?
Right. And the title of the book is The Shaming State. Can you talk about shame and how that happened with, say, the Iraqi refugees? So they come in, as you say, they're the ideal refugee. They're coming in, and yet they still were kind of experienced shame as they went through the process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I will.
Yeah, thank you.
So the experience of shame that I was really interested in understanding was not so much about how shame sort of makes somebody feel per se, but it was sort of around what was the basis for shaming. So in the first case, it appears very, very clearly because, as I said, the moment they arrive into the country, they start to resemble people who live in poverty. And so they immediately have that stigma of being poor. And the kind of assistance that they receive is typically what is called poor relief. So it has a high administrative burden, which I don't know what the equivalent term in New Zealand is. There's a term for it, which I cannot recall at the moment. But it's the conditionality, that it's very conditional. So you have to have meetings with your case managers all the time. You have to constantly demonstrate that you're looking for work. It's not unusual for people's benefits to be cut with no warning. So they experience a very kind of acute sort of precarity. So, so refugees arrive and they obviously need a lot of assistance. So they need to, set up their dwelling. They need to sign up for Social Security. They need to sign up for taxes. They need to put their kids in school. They need to get a car. Depending on sort of literacy levels, they might need some English language classes and so on. And so those things are provided in the initial stages, but then once they start to need things like actual income coming in while they're looking for work, that's when they start to experience a lot of shaming around it because they encounter a form of relief that's already stigmatized. So when, for example, they have cuts in their food stamps, which means that they don't have enough vouchers to go purchase food, and it's a cut that has not been explained, so they go and ask about why that had happened. They are often berated by their caseworkers, so their caseworkers would accuse them of being entitled, of being kind of lazy, wasting people's time. Why are you coming in asking about all your benefits? You really should be looking for work. And they're made to feel, if they're unable to secure employment, which often happens, so in places like Michigan, which is where I did my this particular case study, it was in the 2010s, and Michigan had been dealing from, sort of trying to recover from the recession of 2008. It was a site of car production, auto productions and automakers have had to deal with cuts in jobs and foreclosures, and Detroit went through a bankruptcy, and it was just a lot going on there. So they're already arriving into a landscape that didn't have many jobs anyway, and they're waiting and waiting for some kind of employment. And as they're waiting, they're also trying to learn English and maybe professionalize or re-professionalize. And so the kind of upheaval that they're experiencing is shifted into a personal fault. So the reason why they can't get the job is because they're lazy, they're not trying hard enough, they have this terrible mentality, they expect that they're going to be doctors and engineers, and that's not how it works. But that's not really what I found. What I found is that they were looking for jobs, and there were certain jobs that they didn't want to do necessarily. For example, they didn't quite understand why they were being asked to work in, like, McDonald's, for instance, where the pay in McDonald's wouldn't get you off the benefit anyway, because it was such a low pay that you still needed forms of assistance, and it wasn't exactly a job. It it wasn't a job. It didn't pay enough to put you out of financial dependency. So there was there was some resistance to some kind of paid employment, but it wasn't that they were being too picky, it was that they really just wanted a job that would pay for things. And so being constantly berated and being made to feel lazy sort of carries a tax on them. So they start to kind of feel like they fail their children. Families would often, the adults in the family would talk about themselves as if they'd passed their prime. And these were people in their 30s and 40s. And they would talk about themselves as if, they've sort of, as if they're dead, as if it's sort of a social death, and I'm not really here in it for me. I'm here for my children, and so you see kind of a lost potential of life through that kind of internalization of that sort of shaming approach to it.
And one of the things that struck me in the book is the organisations that were doing this casework were often staffed by former refugees or Iraqis themselves. So often those Iraqi staff were kind of putting the blame on people, saying these refugees didn't understand American culture and had this Iraqi culture, particularly around women working and that sort of thing. Can you talk about how Iraqi staff that you would think on the surface would know this stuff, somehow they ended up choosing the shame?
Yeah, so they definitely know this stuff. So what I noticed was that people were holding on to different bits of knowledge all at the same time. So there are a couple of reasons. One is that the staff of that organization, or any organization that deals with resettling, have to answer to funders. So if you're unable to show success rates, the funding gets cut, so their jobs are also on the line. So there's an immediate sort of frustration with not being able to find a magical, sort of solution around employment. The other thing returns to this notion of shame. So we tend to think of issues like unemployment or poverty, and I think I mean like socially, maybe not us individually in this room, but I think socially there's a very strong understanding of unemployment and poverty as a thing that happens to these other people. It happens, even sympathetic accounts would say, if only they had the education, if only they had the grit, if only they had the means to sort of, if only they had what we had, they wouldn't be where they are. And so even if you're sympathetic, which a lot of people are, there's a way of looking at poverty or poor people in a dehumanizing way. And so it also, being unemployed or being dependent on assistance is represented, particularly in the American context, although I would argue we see it in New Zealand as well, as a certain kind of fall from grace. And what happens is when people who get out of it, the way to interpret it would be to I'm elected, I managed to make it, and because I made it, other people can make it as well. And you hear that kind of narrative elsewhere as well, right? So it's not just in these case studies, but it's not atypical that somebody would say, well, I made it, why can't you? And I think that that's a way to create a sort of a distinction between a group that's carrying the stigma and the group that managed to get out of it. So it creates a distinction between both groups, because actually they do share similarities. So the staff at the agency, I will say they were very sympathetic and they really wanted to help, but they couldn't shake that feeling of blame. And I think part of it was that it was a way to create a distance between them and these families. And it was sort of a symbolic distance, because the staff at the organization were hired at will, it could be fired at will, so they could also lose their job at any day. And they could also lose access to whatever government support services that they may have. So some of them were on Medicaid because their income was too low. So I think it was a way to create a kind of a symbolic distance between them and their clients.
Right, and the clients, all this shaming directed at clients, were the clients able to resist that, or did they kind of absorb the shame?
I think shame is very overpowering. Both were going on. So I think the interesting thing about shame as an emotion is that it is grounded in a kind of an agreement over values. So shame is about is sort of the threat of being expelled from the social for embodying values that are oppositional to the ideal values. And so those families were essentially being shamed for embodying things like laziness and dependency and entitlement, all of these values that are seen as oppositional to the American good values. And I think what's interesting about shame is that it only works if there's a consensus, right? So if people, you can't shame somebody who doesn't share your worldview, right? And so I think what was going on was that there wasn't a tacit acceptance. You shouldn't be on this kind of assistance. This assistance is stigmatizing. This assistance is for bad people. And that was sustained through the stories that were being shared at the organization. So Iraqi families were kind of told these sort of cautionary tales about other welfare recipients, including poor white and poor black people from Michigan. And they were told these stories as if to say, don't be like these people. And so being told, don't be like these people, and then receiving the same kind of assistance makes them feel as if they're like these kinds of people. And so that's why they internalize the shame, but they do try and resist it, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes the resistance to shame produces socially disruptive reactions, so they would resist it by creating a symbolic distance between them and poor Michiganders. And so they would say things like, we're not like these other people who use their welfare money to buy drugs. We don't do that. I don't buy drugs or alcohol. And these people, and they would sort of say it in whispers, these people, they do things like they use drugs and they do things like they drink all the time and they don't get up till noon and so on and so forth. And so they would try and fend off that kind of stigma by attributing it to other people and making their need more legitimate.
Right. And should we move on to the second case study? Because the second case study, as you said, were sort of, I think you said middle class, patriotic, mostly white Americans who suffered in a storm. Was that case quite different? I mean, well, kind of two are the same, but there were differences. And actually, in the book you mentioned that some of your colleagues were kind of critical of your decision to focus on this group because they saw this group as middle class and not in the same category. But why did you pick that group?
Yeah, so this group would be a best case scenario of wanting to study what happens in times of a disaster. If you think about the frame of reference up to the point of Hurricane Sandy was Hurricane Katrina, which you might be familiar with, but it was in New Orleans in 2006 in Louisiana, and it was catastrophic in terms of the impact on people. It was disproportionate in terms of who it affected. It was poor black Americans, and you can definitely see the distinctions around class in terms of access to relief. And I think for me, obviously Hurricane Katrina remains singular in that respect, but I think what it does is that it created a narrative around who can ask for help after disasters and who's affected and who's protected. And there was a kind of a conventional wisdom around hurricane relief and needing help in general, which posits that middle class people are protected by their status or privileged by their status as middle class. They have their community connections, they have their insurance, they have this and that and the other thing. And so that makes it, from the perspective of social science, it makes it less interesting to study. And there's a tendency in the social sciences to always want to look down. So you always want to look at people who are less fortunate, people who are, poor and what have you, because it allows, I don't know, I think it's very problematic because I think it allows, it creates a dehumanizing narrative. It creates a narrative of deficit that is concealed in cases like the New York case, where people were struggling, but because no one was talking about it, it seemed like they were fine and they were invisible in that way. And when I was presenting this in the early stages, it was resistance couched in terms of concern, right? It was sort of like, oh, why are you looking at these people? Why aren't you looking at undocumented people? Why aren't you looking at poor people? And I thought what it does is that it sort of creates scales of suffering, which you can create, but I don't know how relevant or how useful they are, because what it means is that it ignores the fundamental problem around somebody who struggles with poverty, right? Which is not just that, poverty is not just that people don't have money, which is obviously what it is, right? But it's also grounded in a structural decision that makes a certain group of people's production in society less valued to the extent that they're deprived of the means that allow them to live a dignified life. And so what this means is that if you don't understand that there has to be a state intervention to make sure that people live a dignified life in all all facets of society. You won't be able to understand that the state doesn't care about anybody except the power elite. Sara knows. So I was really interested in wanting to understand the experience of middle-class families because actually they were struggling. So their homes, first of all, it was they were told not to evacuate. So that was a man-made error, right? So they were told that they didn't have to evacuate, they were fine. 3 p.m. they're calling the helpline, the city's helpline. Do we need to evacuate? No, you're fine. You're in evacuation zone B. You don't need to. The evacuation zones were not, the maps were not updated. At that point, it would have been like 8 years or so. So they were dated. And so some of those people were trapped in their attics. They had to be rescued by the National Guard the next day. And it was an absolutely terrifying experience. The other thing as well was that some did have insurance, some didn't. But even with insurance, and even as the government said, we are going to help and it's going to be seamless and great and we're removing all red tape. So ideologically, they were very different from resettled refugees in that the language around assistance was very generous, but that was only a language thing. So only discursively and politically, it was sort of described, you know, at the time was President Obama and Bloomberg and Chris Christie in New Jersey, and it was sort of working across the aisles. And it was all about wanting to provide efficient and simple relief. But once the immediate aftermath once the dust settled and people moved on, that community continued to really struggle getting help. So the insurance wasn't coming through, the federally funded federally funded city design program of assistance wasn't working. About half of the people who were on that program, which was called Building Back, opted out because they just couldn't be bothered waiting. Some people had retirement plans that they had to scrap. Some people sold their homes and moved elsewhere. So the community was actually quite affected and it fractured the community. So ideologically, yes, better off, but materially, they had to encounter the same kind of humiliation. It was very different, but it was a denial of vulnerability. Yeah.
And when I read that chapter, it reminded me of Christchurch after the earthquake. Very similar things happened, like the short-term, I think you mentioned euphoria. The short-term euphoria was everyone was like, I remember friends of mine were like, I met my neighbours for the first time, you know, and for the first few months, everyone was helping each other, and it wasn't necessarily government thing, it was just communities doing that. And then as it went on and on, it slowly became more and more stressful. You know, everything went away, we got depressed and miserable and grumpy. And that chapter reminded me of that. And you talked about how the Build It Back program was designed to help homeowners rebuild. But it was kind of designed, and this again reminds me of Christchurch, with the idea that the homeowners may be fraudsters, and so they had to be kind of policed and checked and all this kind of thing. But of course, at the same time, the consultants and big business were involved in it. No one was checking their board. They were just going to have some money. So can you talk about how the process worked, Shani worked in that long-term rebuild program?
Yeah, so what was interesting about that particular program was that it was designed with fraud prevention in mind. And it was really, at the time was Mayor Bloomberg, and he, really what he wanted was that he didn't want to have another Katrina. And by that he meant is that he didn't want the level of fraud that we saw in Katrina. And it was interesting because Hurricane Katrina, so when we talk about fraud by individuals, usually people expected to be between 1% and 3%. And Hurricane Katrina was something like 9%, so they were like, well, that's really high, we don't want to see that happening again. But also what was really interesting about Katrina is that most of the fraud was corporate fraud, so it wasn't actually individual fraud. So when they introduced Build It Back, the idea was that it was going to be simple, but it had this sequential design to make sure that you can't move on to the next step until the previous step has been completed. And the idea was that you wanted to make sure that things are done above board, nobody's, and it wasn't just homeowners, it was also contractors, that contractors also were asking for more than they should be getting, and that everyone's getting what they need. But in theory that sounds great, but the thing is in terms of application that didn't really work quite as well, because if you think about, you have to have the home plans or you know, what do they call the blueprint? Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember the exact term. The plans, yeah, because a lot of it had to be built from scratch. If you lose that in the storm, that takes time to get it back. So people couldn't move into the second step, like beyond inspection, until they provided all the necessary documentation. Some people lost all their documentation. The other thing was that, which is interesting as well, is that these people are living in these homes. These are generational homes that gets passed on from like grandparents to parents to children. And it's a way to you know, I mean, it is talk about the middle class dream, right, of like having kind of a generational wealth. But over the years, people changed the design of their houses. So there were all these little things that they did, you know, maybe added a basement, maybe, you know, revamped the attic, and so it looks different from the plans. And so it's like, well, we can't operate on this because it doesn't match. And so there are all these sort of bureaucratic snags that were going on. But the big thing that made it so much harder was that consultancy firms were paid really hundreds of millions of dollars to design this program. They didn't meet the minimum requirements, so case managers had to have a degree in social work. Most of them didn't have any degree at all. The software that was supposed to assist with the application and saving the paperwork and so on was faulty, so paperwork kept getting lost and not saved. So people would go to these offices. You know, one lady said she went 17 times because each time she goes, she brings in her disk, her USB stick, and it has all the files on it. And they try and save it, and it doesn't save, or it saves, and then she leaves, comes back the next day, and there's no file on the computer. And so it was interesting that the interest in kind of fraud prevention was really just around wanting to prevent homeowners from getting too much, but really it was, again, it was consultancy firms that screwed everyone over. And of course, there was no penalties. I mean, you know, the city just sort of terminated the contract, and that was it. And you know, they made millions and went on with it. The humiliation comes from the repeated demonstration of need. So if you constantly, and this is true in any kind of disaster, right? If you constantly have to go to the office to explain to them why you need help because your house is flooded and you're living in this moldy place, that is a re-traumatization that happens every time. And the other thing is that it makes it seem as if what you're going through is not legitimate because you constantly have to display it, demonstrate it, show them, talk to them about it, talk to different case managers. And so it's the kind of, the constant articulation of need that made people feel very ashamed of being in need in the first place because it felt like they were begging.
Yeah, and I'm just going to, we're running short of time, but I'm going to jump in part 3 of the book. You talk about some economic history, and you talk about that myth of the American dream, individual ruggedness and all that kind of stuff. But you say that the American economy in the 20th century was designed to promote economic growth while providing a safety net and a good standard of living for at least the white middle class, maybe not everyone else. But despite this massive state intervention, the idea that success was due to rugged individualism and hard work was still a central part of the American dream. Can you tell us what happened to that myth of the American dream? How was it incorporated into the rise of neoliberal market fundamentals? When you know, the earlier stuff was based on massive state intervention. That's taken away. But that myth is obviously going to be very useful for neoliberal people.
Yeah, so in this part, basically what I found out is that if I was trying to follow again, I was approaching this in the most open, naive way possible. So with the case of refugees, I figured, okay, well, they're told they can't get the jobs they want. They're not going to get help because they're not working. The second case study is people who work. Well, what kind of help are they going to get? And then I found out, well, actually, that was not so great either. So, but what I was really interested in is why people weren't able to articulate the frustration in ways that recognized the structure of shaming and the structure of state oppression. And why is it that people would talk about, well, I'm hardworking and why is this happening to me? I thought that was really fascinating, and basically that really comes out of a kind of a myth that was sustained. So the myth of the American dream, which is the idea, you work hard, you get places, you have the house, the picket fence, and a job, and your children, and your children will do better than you, and this whole thing of the endless kind of upward mobility. But what's interesting about that is that coincides with a period of government expansion, right? So it's after World War II that you really start to see it in full force, and a lot of it has to do with wanting to counter, the threat of communist ideologies and the idea that it could be better under any other economic system, right? So you start to see this expansion and sort of a mass employment. So you see public works and things like that that facilitate the employment of people at such good rates, you know. So it's like the whole package of healthcare and subsidies, and education is free, and all of those things. And those things obviously were reserved for a certain number of Americans. It definitely was catered to white Americans in particular. Systemically, it excluded black Americans, but it also excluded certain forms of rural work, which is why you see a divide in terms of rural poverty, for instance, in places like West Virginia and so on. But at the same time, as all of these programs were being built and established, the idea was that you were getting places because you were working. So it starts to connect the idea of, you know, of moving up, not to a state intervention that makes sure that wages are high enough and that your union is protecting you, but rather it is connected to you working hard, because that's the spirit of American life, is that you work hard and that's how you get rewarded. What starts to happen when the 1970s roll around is that you start to see automation of production, outsourcing, the shift towards financialization of capital, which meant that workers were not as needed anymore. And so you start to slowly see a decline in the quality of life and a decline in this idea of the American dream. But the material decline doesn't match the ideology or the belief, right? The belief is still very, very powerful, and people still hold on to it. And again, I think that has to do with the kind of a psychosocial reaction, right? Which is that we refuse to confront things that, you know, we sort of disavow truths that are too hard to come to terms with. And I think it's quite shattering to think that you could work all your life and you could work really hard and you still wouldn't make it, because not making it means that you get expelled from a certain kind of respectable polity. And so even though you see a decline and people, you know, continue to sort of, you know, people make less than what their parents make, for example, there's still a kind of a belief that if you work hard enough, you'll make it. But really at the core of the American dream is a kind of independence from government and a kind of a self-aggrandizing kind of narrative around making it because you're strong, because you're invincible. And that persists even as the material reality sort of recedes. And that is a perfect fit for something like neoliberalism, which is all about the idea of a man as an island, right? That you don't have to care about other people. We see it today in terms of, if you look at the language of government today around, you know, hungry children is not a taxpayer's problem, right? So there's this sort of thing around the erosion of kind of communal responsibilities and responsibilities toward each other as citizens, in favor of being very self-focused and self-centered, and thinking that anything good that happens to you is the result of your own hard work, not the result of, again, robust government intervention. Because even as we talk about the rolling back of welfare, obviously the government still has a duty of care that it exercises. So it's still involved in regulatory functions. The roads are safe. You're not, how do I say it? I don't want to say this in a way that's, how do I say this? Okay. You know, you're driving on a road, right? And you can get from point A to point B safely, not because you're exceptional, although that might help, but because the roads have been paid by the government. And when people get sick and they go to the emergency room, they're not there because they're exceptional. They're there because the government is actually paying for that. So this idea that somehow, and the government gets the money from the taxpayer, so the idea that somehow is like, my tax money shouldn't go to waste, is a very focused narrative on dehumanizing certain groups of people, which is why it's important to understand middle class experience, because they benefited handsomely from welfare interventions that are not poor relief. But what happens when they're rolled back? So what happens to how they feel about it when it rolls back? And that's where you start to see a really difficult sort of reckoning, and it doesn't really happen, right? There's a lot of denial about it. There's acknowledgement that the government isn't doing enough, but but it's not sustained. And because the shame is so overpowering, people tend to then frame themselves as, but I'm not like them, you know, I'm not a cheat. I understand some people cheat, but I don't cheat. And there's a kind of a disavowal there.
Okay, okay, I've got one more question. I think we're going to wrap. Can we do welfare better? can we do welfare and providing aid government without that shame factor?
I think we can. I think the big problem is there are two things going on. One is that I often wonder if we could have, instead of a shaming state, could we have a caring state? And I often wonder about how that would be possible when you have such punitive sort of language. But what I believe, and what I found in terms of when I talk to people and interview them, it's true, sometimes people say really harsh things, but I often found that when they would talk harshly about these social others, who are doing all these bad things, it was often in the context of an experience of insecurity, so they're often feeling quite worried about their own insecurity in the world, right? Like, what's going to happen to their children? Are their homes going to be repaired? Are they going to be able to stay in the community? And it was only through that feeling of loss or fear of loss that you start to see a kind of a shaming of social others. And I think that's true. I think that's true most of the time. I don't believe that people are sort of inherently wanting to be punishing. And I think the reason why language around the taxpayer is effective is because people are feeling the pinch. So I think people are actually insecure and people are worried about making mortgage payments and so on. And if you have a culture that shames vulnerability, that corresponds to kind of an imposition of scarcity. So the government imposes a certain kind of scarcity. It says we don't have enough, but somehow we have enough to build prisons and engage in wars and so on, but we don't have enough to help each other. And that's what makes it hard, I think, to see a caring state. But I think that if we start from community level, if we start by normalizing the idea that vulnerability or social vulnerability is actually a shared human condition, so we all need each other, we will all need help at some point beyond our own capacities, and that the basis of human life is mutual interdependence, then we can remove the shame of need. And we can do that through things like, if you think about mutual aid societies, or even if you think during the times of COVID, where we had these food banks that were not structured as charity, but they were structured as, I might need something tomorrow, you need it today, and we're helping each other, and I'm here for you, and you're here for me. That removal of shame around need, coupled with a demand for abundance, I think can restructure the way we interact with the state. And if you want to think of it in terms of even voting or calling to task politicians or protesting or whatever, but that if we begin from grassroots and begin with confronting our own kind of ambivalence about being in need and recognizing that that's a shared social condition, then we can restructure demands of the state, I think. I mean, I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's inevitable either way, that you would have a state that's perpetually shaming or a state that's perpetually caring. But I think it is possible to see a way out of it.
Right, thank you. On that positive note, we might end there, yeah, no, never too, there's going to be more. We're going to, is it a 10-minute break? Or yeah, we'll do a 10-minute break and then we'll come back for a Q&A. But before we go, please, we go back for Sarah and her team. Where can we get this from?
Okay.
Is that on?
Probably shouldn't be recording this. Okay, so if you're in the university, you can get, there's an online copy of the book that you can read in the library. It's sold out of Unity Books here, but you can get it from Unity Books in Auckland. I also have some copies, so if you would like to purchase a copy directly from me, I don't make any money off it. But if you want to do that, you can email me.
Cool. Okay, so back here in 10 minutes for a Q&A. Thank you. Righto, hi again. So we're going to do a Q&A. I can see from here, if you've got a question for Sarah, chuck your hand up and we'll see how we go. Great.
I read a book recently about the rise of neoliberalism in the United States, and it put it well before Ronald Reagan, and couched it as a means of opposing civil rights legislation. And it occurs to me that the shaming society that you're talking about arises with and is a part of neoliberalism. Would you comment on that?
I think that the shaming tendencies that I saw in the case studies relates to something that predates neoliberalism, but is connected to the racial foundation of the United States as well. So, for example, programs like the New Deal that systemically excluded black people function to create a split of class along the color line. And in doing that, it basically facilitated a kind of a continuation of, the failure of Reconstruction, continuation of de facto segregation, and continuation of the aftermath of enslavement and undoing of the kind of Reconstruction hopes. So I think that those elements around shaming that link self-sufficiency to honor and to independence and all these desirable things have a racial foundation to them. I think that they're made a lot worse under neoliberalism, because what happens is that shaming extends and starts to affect people who had been up to a certain point shielded from it. So I think it's definitely exacerbated by neoliberal turn away from the duty of care and turning care into this kind of shameful practice, like a very feminized, weak thing that you're not supposed to ask for.
Kate?
Hi. I was just wondering if you can give or think of examples, either historical or recent, where that shame has been overcome or broken from, and like what it sort of takes to overcome those corrosive impact of social solidarity. Like where have we been able to push through and resist that?
I think there are examples, and I think the examples are often cases where communities can effectively turn away, not turn away from the state in a way that's apolitical, but turn away in a way that's building community coalitions that undermine the state's overwhelming sort of dominant narrative around the shame of need. And we can see examples in New Zealand, for example. If you think about for instance, if you think about the COVID-19 response, which is often presented as a success case. New Zealand is often presented as a model state in terms of the response, which a lot of it is warranted. There was a lot of interest in making sure that the virus isn't spreading. We had sort of a systemic plan around sheltering in place and the alert levels, the lockdowns, etc. But that was presented in a differentiated way. It created, two-tier sort of systems around assistance. So, for example, there was the compensation in relation to COVID versus the job seeker benefit and how they were different, and which again cements a distinction around deserving need versus undeserving need, and cements the sort of shaming around, struggling with a structural factor like joblessness. Versus struggling with like a pandemic, even though both are actually structural things that prevent people from accessing, paid employment, and both are very disruptive things to happen. So you see a kind of a differentiated response, and then you also see, and in the context of New Zealand in particular, obviously unique to New Zealand is the Crown's relation with tangata whenua, and so you saw particularly. And here I'm referencing the work of Maria Barge and Luke Fitzmaurice around the COVID-19 community response. But what we saw there was an emphasis on well-being that ignored activity obligations, ignored health concerns raised by Māori communities, and presented the health risks that Māori communities might face, which are distinct from or different from health risks that other communities might face, as somehow sort of individual problems, like they're not worthy of the same kind of public health campaigns. So there was a big health campaign, for example, around protecting your grandparents and starting the age of vaccination around 65, right? If you have a population that has a lower or a younger sort of population, who are also grandparents, then that excludes these grandparents, and why aren't these grandparents protected? So you see the embeddedness of shame, even in what would seem at first to be a good response. But there was resistance to that. So, if you look at the hold that disinformation took around the time of COVID, communities becoming maybe vaccine skeptics or scared of the vaccine because of all the disinformation online, you start to see a government rhetoric that was quite shaming and almost like making fun of people who are skeptics. And then you also see communities that are more vulnerable to COVID, for example, Māori communities in Northland, who are not getting protection from, say this is a person who lived in Auckland most of my life, from Aucklanders escaping Auckland during lockdowns and bringing COVID with them up north. What we saw was a robust community response. So iwi groups, Māori and Māori groups countered disinformation by providing local expertise and providing a community base to counter the skepticism around the vaccine. They set up checkpoints to prevent to basically keep their community safe, and they did that by exercising the right to self-determination, and they did that by also really not giving a damn, right? So they were like, well, the government doesn't care, we don't care, but we're going to protect our communities, and we're not going to kind of accept the kind of stigmatizing narratives that are being told about us. So that is an example, I think, of a positive response. And there are so many others. I mean, I think about, in the context of the United States with the response to COVID-19, where you can see a much more glaring government absence, particularly in 2020. People did create their own food pantries, and it was presented as a mutual aid response. And even then, it was really interesting to see that even then they had to actively counter the shame. So there was, for example, a case of one of those food banks or food pantries in one of those American cities. I don't remember where, but it was in the New York Times. And it was a person who had been, he was a veteran, so he fought in the Iraq War. And he was showing up to the food bank, and he felt embarrassed or felt ashamed for needing it. And I thought, can you imagine like a person who's done literally everything for their country, and then a pandemic happens that makes everybody unemployed, and this person is ashamed to need to go to the food pantry. But what was happening was that people were like, there's no shame in that, so it's actually for everybody, and there was a way to kind of actively counter the shaming sort of narrative around being in need.
I was wondering, in terms of the experience of Iraqi resettled refugees and how that might contrast with, for instance, the South African refugees who have just come to the US. Like, if you take away those elements of language barriers, Islamophobia, racism,
colour.
Yeah, racism. How does that kind of yeah, I mean, obviously there'd still be some shaming happening, and the focus on the New Yorkers is quite illustrative of that, but I'm interested about that.
So I think that what was surprising about the experience of Iraqi resettled refugees is that when I asked them about the things that they really struggled with the most, these were not the things that came up. So part of it was that they were in Michigan, so there was a large Arab community in Michigan. Some of them had lived elsewhere in the United States and had experienced some racism, particularly the ones who appear visibly Muslim. But the thing is, in terms of access to assistance, that's all organized at the federal and state level, and it really depends on it depends much more on that. Of course, they might encounter things around employment, discrimination around employment, and of course, I wouldn't be surprised if they had stories around Islamophobia, but actually in our conversations, that's not what came up. What came up was not being able to have regular access to food stamps, for example. I think that the case around South African refugees will be very interesting to see, because I think it constitutes, in my view, I think it constitutes an empty promise. Because I think unless you have robust systems of integration, you will encounter the same kind of issues. And it might not be, the language thing is interesting because it might not even be a thing, some of the cases, some of the people I spoke with worked as interpreters in Iraq. So language wasn't even a barrier. And I would be interested to see how that pans out for the recent arrivals, because it's all about how they're being integrated and what kind of services they will receive. I wouldn't be surprised, of course, if you will have different experiences on the basis of racialization. I should also note that Arabs in the United States are considered white.
Can you elaborate on that?
It's a census category, so in the United States, the legal status around white really comes out of owning property. So if you could demonstrate or prove that you're white, you'll be able to buy property. And so it's in people's best interest to fight for their whiteness. And Arab migrants who arrived in the early 20th century, some in the 19th century, were described as Mohammedans. They were excluded because they were part of that faith, and so they weren't really white, so they couldn't have property. And it was through legal fights around wanting to establish whiteness that they became white in the census. Of course, that doesn't mean that they're not racialized, and of course, 9/11 is a moment where they experience acute racialization, and of course all the tropes around, real bad Arabs and all of that stuff exists. But in terms of the census, they're white.
Any other questions?
There was an idea that Marx talked about in the critique of the Gotha program, that the proletariat and bourgeoisie are relative categories. There has to be a third category to make them exist, and the third category was unemployed people. And there was a quote from a neo-Keynesian economist, which was the only thing that's worse than being exploited is not being exploited. And so my question is how much is sort of unemployment, and therefore the shaming of the unemployed, integral to capitalism?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because the basis, in the case of Iraqi resettled refugees, right, they were struggling to find paid employment, right? And the big thing was that there is no shame in working. Do anything, it's better than nothing, and you don't want to be unemployed because you don't want to be seen as dependent, as unproductive, as lazy, as having no structure to your day, and so on. But what was interesting about that is that the paid employment opportunity that was available to them were all sort of low-paying employment anyway, that was already seen as degraded jobs anyway. So they were the kind of jobs that nobody would want to do. They were the kind of jobs that they were described in the organization as basic jobs. And when I asked about that, they were like, McDonald's, Tim Horton, that kind of thing. So there were jobs that don't actually bestow any kind of status other than you would say that you're working so you're not idling. So the big thing in the American imagination, which I think we can say in New Zealand as well, is that there's real stigma around this idea of idling. So and it comes to be connected to things like things around deserving kinds of poverty versus undeserving kinds of poverty. And there's a very strong belief in the United States that she who does not work shall not eat. And so there's this thing around that as well. But what I found was that if you look at middle class experiences, is that as we're shifting into a more and more careless state, where actually workers aren't needed all that much, it's more about the shame comes from displaying any kind of need. Any kind of need becomes a burden. Any kind of needs comes to indicate a moral failure.
All right, so I think, no, there's one more question. Okay, yep, last question, I think.
Thank you. The answer to your last question, any sort of need elicits shame. How do you, or can you, relate that to the New Zealand experience of now?
I find it very troubling, particularly now, the current language, the current government discourse around taxpayers' money. And I think that you can see it in the way that even children are being blamed for being poor. So it used to be that we would have some kind of compassion for children, and we made distinctions between adults' bad choices and the children being innocent and not having a choice. But we're seeing that increasingly going away. And it seems to me that it's getting to a point now where everybody's sort of contained into their family bubbles. And you know, I think that's very worrying, very alarming, because the whole point, really the whole point of living in a state is that you give up some of your freedoms in exchange for some kind of measures of security. And that measure of security is not only criminal justice, it's not only about putting people who do bad things away, but it's also about taking care of people and making sure that the roads are paved, the hospitals are well staffed, the children are fed, the schools are good, and so on and so forth. And having labor protections, for example, and all sorts of things. And we're starting to see those things being unraveled, increasingly unraveled, because of things like, oh, well, it's going to cost money, it's taxes, etc. And what that means is that we no longer have a shared sense of responsibility as citizens to each other. So if people, if you don't care what happens to somebody who's across town from you, not you personally, but if somebody doesn't care about a person who lives across town from them, who might be living in a damp or cold home, then we don't really have citizenship, and we don't really have a state. We just have these families and individuals, and you know, that's your thing about living in a society. There's no such thing as society. And that to me would be the most anti-democratic thing, I think. So I do think it's very dangerous to not have a sense of responsibility, and I see it very clearly in the language of government today, which again is very appealing because everybody's feeling the pinch as well. And so they think if I could just hold on to more of my taxpayers' money, I won't have to worry about it, and I'll be able to pay for things, and you start to see the cascade of social harm.
Sorry, just
Oh, yes, all right. Cool, thank you. All right, we'll finish there, because it's nearly bedtime, so some of it's oldies. But yeah, thank you, Sarah, for talking to us. We've got a copy of our latest magazine. It's very nice.
Thank you, that's really lovely. There's a picture of a baby in there.
Yes, our youngest member. Yeah, join me in thanking Sarah once more.